Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. It's a good day today. I gotta say that, man. It's been a good day. Weather was pretty decent, and then at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, here we had this brainstorming event that Onitase put on, and a good handful of us were present. And I think it was constructive. It also highlights some things, too, that we have to be very careful of as Black folks, that when we are trying to have a discourse, a lot of folks will, have their objections, which they can feel free to have. But at the end of the day, not a lot of those who will object to points being made will straight up and down jump in and dedicate themselves to getting the job done. And so, that's something I want to say to you guys. When this curriculum starts to really roll. Right now, it's just me doing it. And so with me, things take time. I do several different things at a time. But when things start to roll, what we want to do is have soldiers who jump in, if the water hits them at their knee, waist, neck, but they're gonna jump in and they're gonna put in some work, and that's what we got to do. In the beginning, there's gonna be some folks who won't be on the same page. We got to find ways to get everyone on the same page. And once we start to get ourselves on the same page, we just got to jump in and do it. While I'm talking about doing work, I also want to put this out there. Something dawned on me in the past, and the thought came back to me very recently. One of the things we want to do, one of the things I'd like to do is if you know someone who's good at developing like simple game apps, I like to get in contact with someone like that, a Black person who knows how to build some apps, simple game type stuff. It's a particular game that's been done already in apps, but I would like to do a little bit of a twist on it. I want to create something that can, we could have multiplayers, challenges, tournament type stuff. So if you know someone who has that kind of expertise, by all means, please send them my way. All right. I would like to build with them and see how we can help each other achieve this goal. So today's show. And before I go forward, tomorrow, the Harsh Reality Podcast is going to have myself, Onitase, and Reese from the Queen's Council Party. We're all going to be on one broadcast tomorrow. We're going to be on their latest episode together. So keep your ears open. It's not going to be a live stream, to my knowledge. Keep your ears open for when that posts. That's everyone on KWAZ radio. Every show will be on one episode tomorrow. It should be fun. All right, make sure you tune in. On today's show, as you can see, if you're watching this live stream or the playback on YouTube, on my screen, I have this paper that I want to read. That's called Communalism in Pan Africanism, a Retrospect. And if you tune into the last live stream episode I did, I had very good engagement in the chat room that time. Shout out to Lisa T and Athrazer. It was a good time. And in that discussion, it was mentioned in the reading about how big a part communalism and how big a part communalism plays in traditional Africa, and so especially in traditional African education. And so, that reminded me of this paper I came across some time ago that talked about communalism in the aspect of Pan Africanism. And I think should be a cool read. I haven't read it yet, only the abstract. So let's go through it, and you tell me what you think about the paper at the end. So the abstract, as always, is like a summary of the paper, start to finish. The abstract says that this paper examines the principles of communalism underlying in Pan-Africanism that was given institutional expression in the Organization of African Unity. It conceptualizes the phenomena on one hand and contextualizes it on the other through an empirical examination of some of the challenging moments in post-independence era when its solidarity was withheld by exogenous and endogenous factors, in and out factors. We contend that communalism appeared more of a selfish, instrumentalist project. The study illustrates these sordid historical moments with some cases of political instability in the continent in the early decades of independence and the economic crisis of the 80s, among others. It attributes this development to the absence of community either at the micro level of the component states or macro continental level, and concludes that part of the contemporary ethical breakdown in the continent arises from failure of the OAU to institutionalize communalism. And, right there, that gives you an idea of what this paper is about, and it gives you something to think about as we do the reading. We've got to get back as Black folks back to community, back to communalism, right? Back to making sure that everyone is taken care of in our society. Interestingly enough, the key words here are socialism, neoliberalism, non-interference, Ubuntu, which is what we talked about last time in the last episode, and post-independence. But it's funny that there's socialism and neoliberalism. A lot of Africans view what was traditionally communalism. They view that the answer in Africa is socialism. So let's see where this paper takes us. In the introduction, ethical breakdown ethical breakdown is hunting the entire African continent? Hunting, okay. The adverse consequences transcends politics, economics, and socio-cultural dimensions of daily life in the continent. Inordinate, private, acquisitive drive has come to mar traditional African commitment to the common good. And that's so important, this commitment to the common good. We got to get back to that. Civilian coups have now replaced military coups that erstwhile constituted an albatross on the continent, usually executed through subtle violation of the sanctity of the Constitution in a legitimate exercise of constitutional amendment to secure self-perpetuation. For instance, it was only the alertness of Nigerians in 2006 that frustrated the attempt under President Olusegun Obasanjo, who ironically graduated today as an ideologue of democracy and crusade against corruption in Nigeria. But the uncanny project succeeded in Burundi, where the parliament comprised and adjusted the constitution to pave way for the incumbent president, Pierre Nkurunziza, to have a third term. You see, I mentioned this last time. The crazy thing about our situation, right, is that African names and language and stuff evades us now. It's almost like foreign to our tongue, right? And also because we're so centered here in the West, you know, we oftentimes don't know all of these folks from, you know, these different countries in like West Africa even, you know. In Republic of Congo at the time of this study, President Sassou Nguesso had sacked ministers who opposed his unconstitutional third-term bid from his cabinet. Similarly, oppositional politics has been perfected into an instrument solely for bargaining subordinate positions. This has not only compromised its traditional role of checks in a democratic setting, but puts at risk public sympathy for legitimate opposition elsewhere in Africa, especially among Western media and academics who are often quick to generalize manifestations of social ills in one part on the entire continent. Again, another illustration from the unfolding macabre dance in Burundi, where the former opposition leader at the time of the study accepted the position of deputy head of parliament in a government he once criticized. In virtually all African states, one form of struggle or the other border on unresolved national questions. Regional and sub-regional institutions are not left out of this quagmire. Incontrovertibly, crass opportunism has replaced Africa's social orientation, where the society comes before the individual. Right? Society is coming before the individual. The vices of subjugating common good to rash individuality has manifested in broken highways, bankrupt cities, collapsing bridges, failed schools, the unemployed, the underpaid, and the uninsured all suggest a collective failure of will. African situation is so pathetic that various commissions have been organized to explore how the North can help the continent. Damn. The situation, which some scholars had since branded as African dilemma, has perpetually been on the front burner of academic debate, culminating on the existing preponderance of discourses. A common theme in the narratives is the assumption that the contemporary African social crisis evolved from traditional communal ways of life, because Africa allegedly tended towards the past rather than the future. And that's an interesting statement, right? We know that there's nothing wrong with, I guess, having some conservative principles that will make you, tend to the past or trend to the past. But you do have to modernize. You do have to keep up with modern society. Right? So it's an interesting little balance that has to occur there when you're the leadership of a nation. And so that's the thing that, we talk about on the show all the time, is that your leadership has to be of ones who were educated, right, to be leaders, ones who pass through organizations. So you pass through the old ways, but because of the time that you're doing it, you see things in a contemporary setting, you look at what others are doing, how other, nations are emerging, and you need to follow suit to some extent without really corrupting the moral fiber of the society. This study rejects the argument. On the contrary, it argues that communalism was dynamic in the context of the pre-colonial African societies it served. It was an institution for social engineering and the ideology of nation building, while colonialism unfortunately distorted or outright subverted. And that contemporary African crisis stems from the failure of the post-independence ruling class to internalize the virtues and values of communalism arising from the inadequacies of the colonial recruitment process and inherent greed. That is nothing but a whole word right there. One of the problems with a lot of African quote-unquote nations, Caribbean, on the continent, what have you, is that coming out of colonialism and only having known colonialism up until that point, a lot of folks thought that a lot of what the colonial powers did was like there was some virtue to what they did, and there was some value to what those colonial powers did. And so in a lot of ways they continued, those standards. And what those guys didn't realize, right, the ruling classes didn't realize, is that if it's European, it cannot work for you. If it's European, it cannot work for you. I don't care if you're talking about diet. I don't care if you're talking about education, self-help. I don't care what you're talking about. I don't care if you're talking about podcasting, like when to post a podcast episode. No, if it's European, it cannot help you. I've never seen one of those things help. Now, I'm not talking about, certain things like medicines or whatever, and one can even argue that those don't really help you either. But I'm saying that if it's designed by them, you have to go the opposite direction for the most part. The objective of this study is to examine the communal consciousness in Pan Africanism during its high noon and how much of that legacy remains in modern Africa. We concede that variation existed in Africa, in African shared cultural values, but even in this regard, there were usually broader perspectives to social phenomena than others. Therefore, we have adopted here a macro-analytical definition of the concept of communalism, conscious of basic continental identities. The study is constructed into 5 segments for analytical convenience in the following order: introduction, conceptual clarification, the cradle of Pan-Africanism, an empirical appraisal of communal consciousness in Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanism in the context of neoliberalism and the conclusion. The concept of communalism. The absence of a consensual definition has resulted in the misconceptions, misrepresentations, and sometimes outright distortion of the concept of communalism. One sense in which it has been flagrantly abused is a notion that tends to associate it with communal conflicts in a multi-ethnic state because it is thought to emphasize exclusiveness, thereby making intercommunal differences permanently asymmetrical and irreconcilable. Communalism, to the proponents of this school of thought, is segregational and exclusive and therefore propagates disharmony. You don't want that. It is seen as a catalyst for communal violence. So it is counterproductive to development and therefore something to be avoided like leprosy, right? Old African saying, avoid it like the plague, avoid it like leprosy. Unfortunately, it is from the above dimension that the concept is commonly associated with Africa, either by those who are unfamiliar with socio-historical dynamics of the continent or on account of self-imposed ignorance to veil the perpetuation of the degradation of Africa by the international community. To them, Africa's retarded growth and prosperity is attributable to lack of adequate interaction among the different ethnic groups due to their attachment to their communal culture. Therefore, this view does not capture our definition in this study. Within the framework of this paper, communalism connotes a state of social cohesion, whereby individuals in the society perpetually strive towards identified fundamental virtues with the objective of improving the common good of the society while not unduly compromising individual freedom. In today's brainstorm, but only to say from the pro-Black perspective on KWAZ radio, there was a sister from Angola there. And she took the stance of, you know, and not wrong, not right, but she took the stance of, you know, you can't just come up in Africa, right, into people's country and throw your weight around, essentially, right? Start determining, you know, what you're doing there, etc. You can't rub the people wrong who are already there, and that's true. My counter to that, though, is usually when that kind of stuff happens, when the native people in a place look at, you know, their foreign brother or sister, and they look at them as people who are taking advantage or, you know, being a burden on their systems that they have in place already. That usually comes out of the fact that, and this is what I'm actively working against when I talk about building curriculum. Family, you cannot go to another person's country. I don't care how much family they are to us, how related we are, etc., and just lodge yourself in the place and take from the systems that they put up. That goes for America, the Bahamas, that goes for Trinidad, that goes for, you know, the continent, you know, countries on the continent of Africa. This is why when I push the education thing, I'm pushing for you to be able to, for your children, for your grandkids, to be able to be problem solvers, right? Like only to say, we'll call it in the pro-Black compendium, reciprocity, right? You want to be able to go to these places equipped to help them with their burden and lift everyone up at the same time, right? You have to have the mindset that you're going there to improve the common good of the society. You see what I'm saying? While not infringing on anyone who's there already. And so this right here is an understanding that we really need to get back to, and we need to understand it in this sense right here. I hear folks and I know every week now I'm talking about them, but it's such a damaging group. The ADOS and the FBA groups are so damaging to Pan Africanism, right? That you know, the thing I've heard them complain about is, well, how come they can't go to Africa and get land? How come no? And the thing about that is, like, dude, those countries aren't giving their own people land. Their own people have to go there and buy land. Have to not go there, but have to be there and buy land. Like, their own people have to buy resources. It's the nature of how this thing works. When folks come to America, no one's giving them land. No Black people who come to America, no one's giving them land. So the same thing happens in reverse. Right, but so you can't have the mindset that you're going to return, you're going to repatriate to Africa, and you want people to furnish you with a life in Africa. If you can't get it where you are, why do you think you're going to be just, you know, automatically getting it where you're going? Well, so instead, what you want to do, and this is really the fix. The fix is in the mindset. It's in the education. Fix is in head back to these places, you know, and go back with knowledge that will help everyone, yourself and everyone who you meet there when you arrive. That's the fix. By the way, if you're listening live or even in the playback, please give me a thumbs up. I had a couple people on last time, and I think I had one like. You know, a good dozen or so, or 3 dozen listens, but one like. And the likes are what, you know, there's a couple of things that YouTube looks at. They look at your likes, they look at your watch hours, so how long you stay in or listen to an episode. So hit the thumbs up button, please. That helps the channel grow. To continue, all members of the community voluntarily cooperate without coercion because it is their way of life. Bind together by a common purpose and commitment each individual is proud and much obligated to help any other member of his or her community. The individual in African traditional society is oriented to live a symbiotic lifestyle, Take note of that. Symbiotics means both entities benefit, right? The individual in African traditional society is oriented to live a symbiotic lifestyle with his fellow men and women in a kind of beneficial reciprocity. So like when I just talked about, like the whole ADOS FBA thing, complaining that, Africa isn't given no citizenship, they're not given no land and all this kind of stuff, which is untrue to a certain extent because, African countries have offered land and citizenship to those of us outside of her, right? And the thing about that is, like I've been saying, Africa will definitely welcome you if you have a symbiotic mindset, right? Where you're there to give your expertise and in return, and in fact, I think a lot of African countries, I think the governments would welcome a people who can come and build infrastructure, who could come and raise the economy, etc., right? I think they would actually give land to groups of people who will come with those abilities to build the country up. And that's where you want to be. You don't want to be a beggar wherever you go. You want to go there, keep your head down, build up the country, live as one with the people that you meet there. Observably, critics tend to suggest that this kind of traditional and social organization is what contributes clientelism and politics of the belly in contemporary Africa. In reality, such opinion tends to erroneously equate the authentic traditional community to its pseudo post-colonial counterpart, and therefore judging it out of context. So essentially, even like what I described, some people will say, some of the people that this author is talking about would say that I'm promoting, right? Coco's promoting clientelism, right? Or politics of the belly, where you're going there to enrich yourself. No, I'm not saying anything about going there and enrich yourself. But the reason why people would see it that way, and some people in turn, both inside and outside the continent, is because they've internalized the colonial way of thinking, right? If they're not former colonists themselves. You see, the colonizers, that's how they think. The colonizers, if they leave to go somewhere, it's for their belly. They go to enrich themselves, right? So that's not what I'm saying at all. And as the author points out here, in reality, that's not at all what we're trying to do here. It's about reciprocity. While the traditional system permitted individual freedom, it restricted it to the extent it challenged the communal good. Thus, when individuality pursues self-enhancement through crass, opportunistic means, it becomes a vice to abhor in African consciousness. This guaranteed harmony in the society by preventing the inherent social crisis which the tension between individual freedom and society interest often precipitates. Fundamental to communalism, therefore, is the possession of Ubuntu, which amounts to the individual being caring, humble, thoughtful, considerate, understanding, wise, generous, hospitable, socially mature, socially sensitive, virtuous, and blessed. The individual is inculcated with these social values and desirable ethical standards through a conscious process of citizenship, education throughout his nurturing years in the community. Through this process, she or he imbibes the notion of voluntary obedience based on the independent nature or interdependent nature of the community that constitute the core of traditional African cosmology. So I want to point out something here that I read. The previous sentence, the individual is inculcated with these social values and desirable ethical standards through a conscious process of citizenship education throughout his nurturing years. And that citizenship education, you don't have to be, now it's ideal, but you don't have to be on the continent to be nurtured in this way. You don't have to be on the continent, birthed, like we say, born, bred, and the dead, Bahamian. You don't have to be, born and bred on the continent to have this type of mindset. But you do have to have the mindset when you arrive on the continent. And so you could build that mindset through yourself, through your children, etc., and to your future generations until that time comes when we see our numbers start to leave the West and head back to the continent. But it's something that you have to learn. It has to be in your life experiences as you mature. You see, and so this is what we need more of too. When we talk about curriculum again, the curriculum has to reflect this kind of mindset, right? Nurturing this kind of mindset in the individual. Shaker describes it as the philosophy of live and let live, a mode of living evidently characterized by empathy and by consideration and compassion for human beings. And like I said last time, a lot of this stuff is all well and good, but this stuff is to be practiced African to African, right? Hence, a typical African community aspired to accommodate everyone with affection based on the principles humanism and egalitarianism. And again, what the edit that needs to occur here is that it's Africans in the African community. To recap, communalism in this context equates a mutual responsibility by society and its members to do their very best for each other with the full knowledge and understanding that if society prospers, its members will share in that prosperity, and that society cannot prosper without the full cooperation of its members. And that is a great recap of the point. Everyone plays a role in this African society. Everyone must do their best for each other, right? And we have to understand that it's not about me, not about you or just me. It's not about just our ethnic group within the race, right? Within the community, right? We have to understand that we all share in this together. We are all we have. We got to share in this together and make it work. The concept of Pan Africanism. As a concept, Pan Africanism is diverse in definitions depending on the background of scholars. Perhaps this arises from the different meanings and orientations it has adapted at the different stages of its evolution. But the model adopted in this study is the conception Kwame Nkrumah represented. From this perspective, Pan-Africanism is the movement aimed for the attainment of the political kingdom, the complete independence and self-determination of African territories as a first goal, which was to culminate in some form of African union within the milieu of a social system suited to the traditions, history, environment, and communalistic pattern of African society. So when we talk today about brainstorming for the work that we want to do in this upcoming year, in 2021. One of the suggestions I gave, and a few others gave the similar suggestion, right? But one of the things I said was, up front, if you're going to put out works for people to read, be it advertisements, etc., the very first thing you need to hit people with is, what is the benefit to them? Why should we band together? And right here is the reason why we should band together. This is it. These are the benefits of communalism. Is the benefits of us building a nation, working towards nationhood, right? Or working towards an African Union if you're already on the continent. Right. This is it. If you weren't there today and you want to be involved, there's a meetup again in 2 weeks from today. And we're working on writing for now, and so I suggest you reach out to me or reach out to Onitase on Twitter, right? The Pro Black Perspective Podcast, Book of Power. Reach out and ask to join in and be able to help. Okay, the more people in these endeavors, kind of the better. But now, when I say more people, I'm not saying that we need 100 people, but a diverse group of people working on a problem tends to solve the problem, right? If the problem is solvable to begin with. So, make sure, ask and be serious. Be serious. But whenever we're putting out some kind of content to the people to try to engage our people more and try to build and to organize more, we got to put out there the benefit of being a community, of communalism, of what it really means to practice communalism. To continue. In other words, Pan-Africanism entails the extension of mutual social responsibility of the African family to the African continent as a whole through the individual nations. It was also my point before, too, that you can have individual nations, right? But it's better to be a nation within the continent of Africa. There's power in numbers. The concept underscores the imperative of cooperation among Africans, right? Subsumed in the concept of Pan-Africanism is the notion of African socialism, defined as a complex of social purposes and the consequential social and economic policies, organizational patterns, state structure, and ideologies, which can lead to the attainment of those purposes. The central objective is to remold African society in such a manner that the humanism of traditional African life, that's the Ubuntu, reasserts itself in a modern technical community. And that's key. Right? We don't necessarily need to change Africa from what it was pre-colonialism. What we need to do is get rid of colonial thinking, colonial outlook. Go back, Sankofa, go back to our ways pre-colonialism, but keep in mind that we also want to remain modern at the same time. In other words, the principles underlying communalism are given expression in modern circumstances. Invariably, the two concepts converge as representing an attitude of mind diverging only in their application to given geopolitical contexts. Pan-Africanism, within this framework, epitomized giving expression to the principles of communalism on a broader African continental scale in modern circumstances. Pan-Africanism and socialism are therefore coterminous, having a common descent in communalism. cultural alienation and the need to restore previous confidence, which colonialism eroded, motivated the early nationalists to embark on cultural restoration and affirmation. During this epoch, young Africans recruited into the colonial project ironically appropriated African communalism as an ideology to first prosecute the anti-colonial campaign, and second, to survive as young nations under the hostile regime of a new brand of international hegemony, neo-colonialism. Communalism was reconceptualized and rebranded as socialism of diverse forms at home and Pan-Africanism at the continental level. The two concepts converge more than they diverge, at least in conception. We shall employ them concurrently in this study, specifying only when it becomes imperative for the sake of clarity. If you're liking this reading so far, man, hit the like, hit the thumbs up. I seem to have a couple people in here listening, so hit the thumbs up. You know, share the stream, let people know what's going on. All right, let's get more people in here taking a listen. Outside of myself and only to say, you don't really hear a lot of this type of conversation in a podcast, right? So, and you know, that's not a knock necessarily. I'm just saying that a lot of the folks who you guys support in thousands, they're not talking about anything serious, right? This is stuff to feed your mind right here and feed your soul, as a matter of fact. The cradle of Pan-Africanism. The Pan-African movement began in the 19th century essentially as an anti-racist consciousness against a social system that discriminated against the blacks in the U.S. The future leaders of independent Africa were formally initiated into its fold at the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress in October 1945 in Manchester, England, with Kwame Nkrumah, future champion of the anti-colonial struggle in Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta, the rally point of opposition to British colonial rule in Kenya, in attendance. From this moment, Pan-Africanism was focused on achieving independence from colonial rule throughout the continent so that Africans could rule themselves and achieve continental unity. Ghana's independence in 1957 greatly enhanced the fame and fortune of Pan-Africanism. The consciousness of the movement to reenact traditional African gregariousness in post-colonial Africa culminated in the agreement to unite Ghana and Guinea under Sekou Touré in 1959. Shortly after, Liberia under President Tubman joined the duo under the terms of the Sanequeli Declaration in setting up a loose Federation of West Africa. Sorry. The Organization of African Unity emerged in 1963 as an institutional framework to realize the ideals of Pan-Africanism under a tumultuous process of ideological rift between the radical Casablanca bloc and the moderate Monrovia bloc. Henceforth, in this study, we discuss Pan-Africanism concurrently with the OAU because we are convinced that the former was an ideal given an institutional expression in the latter. So now in the section called Communal Consciousness in Pan-Africanism and Empirical Appraisal. By the way, if you want to drop a comment in the live chat as well, I'll respond to comments as well. Early nationalists and leaders of independent African states were determined to give Africa an identity and a clear sense of direction. Consequently, they adopted different brands of political systems within which they hoped to realize their national and continental objectives. For instance, Ghana under Nkrumah, the chief exponent of Pan-Africanism during this era, adopted socialism because it was thought to be the quickest route out of underdevelopment through rapid rate of economic progress and protective social justice reform and equality. You could go back and listen to some episodes from the pro-Black perspective where they break down the problem, only to say breaks down the problem with socialism in Africa. Many other African leaders followed suit. In Zambia, President Kwanda launched humanism. Nyerere of Tanzania instituted Ujamaa, drawing references from the African tradition of communalism. Other variants of socialism existed in the continent. A few countries, such as Ivory Coast, Kenya, Malawi, Senegal, adopted the capitalist route. But in spite of this, collective welfare perpetually re-echoed in their discourses. So that's an interesting dynamic. That's one to look at more closely. The idea that, individually you embrace capitalism, but as far as group goes, you practice socialism and African socialism. Shout out to the pro-Black perspective. Only to say he's in the chat room. Came in a little late. He'll catch up with the beginning later on. But thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to have you in the chat room. But the fundamental question is, to what extent did these African leaders succeed in their respective agenda of building coherent societies founded on humanism? And how has it influenced contemporary Africa? The answers to the above questions are located in two dimensions, national and continental. While our major concern is the continental dimension which Pan-Africanism represented, we shall not hesitate to delve into respective national dynamics to enrich our analysis, particularly where they reverberated to produce direct results on the entire continent. Right? Something to come back to. The immediate post-independence social reality. This is another section. The efforts of the Pan-Africanists in African struggle cannot be underestimated. Their mobilization of grassroots support was grand. They supported the anti-colonial struggle in Africa, and their campaigns humbled the imperialists and ultimately gave a voice to Africa on global events. Their successful struggle for independence produced across Africa a leadership cadre that was to take many African countries into independence. But the way and manner African states had their independence portrayed the process as rash and stampeded without adequate preparations. Thus, the laws, values, and structures of the colonial era survived into post-colonial period. Now, that's an interesting point to consider as well, right? The reason why they would have carried on, some of the ways of the colonizers was because they didn't take sufficient time to adopt their own thing. The endurance of these colonial legacies decades after independence gives the impression that the pre-independence African nationalists merely appropriated pre-colonial African communal values conceptualized in Pan-Africanism as an instrumentalist project. The first wrestle power from the imperialists, and second gain legitimacy at home for selfish class interests. That is a common outlook by people, especially Africans outside of Africa, right? A lot of those guys kind of rushed in, took over these countries, but it was really for their personal gain. There was no building, really. There was no nation building that really and truly occurred. It was just more of a continuation of what the colonizers did with an African face on top of it now. The petty bourgeoisie consciousness of the African ruling class first manifested in the gestation stage of the OAU, when contrary to the avowed ideals enshrined in the non-aligned movement, African elite engaged in bitter ideological contests in the Cold War era. The Casablanca bloc, on one side, argued for a United States of Africa, based on the African history of communalism. But this was bitterly and successfully resisted by the pro-capitalist Monrovia bloc, who categorized a conception of stronger and closer unity in the continent as idealistic. So the OAU was founded without a solid form of integration. The next major test for post-independence African leaders' commitment to the to the renaissance of communal values more in declarations rather than conduct was internal evolution of political culture. In virtually all the independent African states, colonial political history was viciously attacked for its anti-democratic posture, while the new independence order was allegedly founded on democratic ideals. To initiate development and convince the outside world that Africa was capable of autonomous governance, enormous powers were either given to the state or it arrogated it in order to marshal resources. Given the realities of the time, this may have been a welcome development, but it lacks internal mechanism to check the abuse of such power. I agree with that. Again, if you follow what these Europeans do, you'll end up in disaster. The precariousness of the system soon manifested all over Africa. In Ghana, for instance, opposition was brutally suppressed while a one-party state was declared in Ghana's steady march to dictatorship and anarchy under Nkrumah. The Ghana situation was replicated in virtually all the African states, which precipitated an era of political repression and instability. These brands of civilian dictatorships directly provoked the military coups that ended the first generation of African leadership or politician in very tragic circumstances beginning from 1963. A section of the discourses on traditional Africa often tend to invoke the alleged exclusive control of political positions by elders in traditional Africa. The reality, however, was that decisions were largely consensual, while the elders tolerated dissent and avoided conscious deployment of the apparatus of the state to witch hunt opposition. That's interesting. So, elders were complicit, or at least they tolerated, right? So while the elders tolerated dissent and avoided conscious deployment of the apparatus of the state to witch hunt opposition. That's interesting. Okay. Post-colonial authoritarianism clearly perverted this value of leadership in African worldview and entrenched distrust. Under the canopy of common good, repression and suppression, the same abuses, fragrant human rights violations that characterized the colonial regime became reenacted, indicating a clear failure to institutionalize communal value at home. Yeah, because, again, I hate to be repetitive, but, you know, if the African elites were just following what the colonizers laid down, then of course the colonizers didn't lay down communalism, right? The colonizers laid down personal gain, and by any means necessary, so to speak, to obtain your personal gains. So, yeah, the African elite, you know, they really didn't do us any favors. In the chat room, Onitase says, the pro-black perspective says, African elites definitely sold us out. Yeah. Yeah, they sold us out They sold us out. They were trying to protect their own asses, and so they carried on with, they tried to protect their own gains, and so they carried on with the colonizer way, as opposed to the communal way of things, and just threw a monkey wrench in the whole movement of Pan Africanism, essentially. The Cavalier consciousness vividly manifested on the continental stage. The frugality of their nascent independence had propelled African ruling class to evolve Iron Curtain in extreme assertion of sovereignty and domestic jurisdiction to survive. The looming presence of imperialism on the world stage ordinarily made this strategy not only legitimate, but imperative. But that it did not accommodate inbuilt checks to prevent abuses made it either limited in thought or, yet again, an instrumentalist device. For instance, Article 3 of the OAU Charter proclaimed non-interference in the international affairs of states as one of the basic principles of the organization. Another principle enshrined respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each state and its inalienable right to independent existence. A resolution of the OAU at the first ordinary session of the Assembly of Head of States and Government of the then newly formed Organization of African Union, OAU, in Cairo in 1964, finally reaffirmed members' obligations to respect one another's domestic jurisdiction. These provisions were even demonstrated in the municipal legislation of member states. And see, that's the thing. When you've been corrupted, right? Or when you have corrupt folks put up protections for their corruption, right? We saw Donald Trump in America here, who apparently lost the election to Joe Biden, right? Trump had a general or something, someone in the military some months ago, when Trump was looking to turn out soldiers against protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters in America. Trump remembered that guy, right? And as he lost the election here, Trump fired that guy. Trump fired a guy who spoke against Trump using soldiers to kind of subdue or quell the protests, right? He said basically, it's wrong to sick soldiers on protesters. When Trump lost the other day, Trump fired that guy like a day or two later. So what is Trump setting up to do? Right? Why would you fire that guy? And you lost the election, you have like 70 days or something to move your ass on out of there. Right? But Trump got rid of that guy because Trump is setting up a situation, it would seem, where he doesn't want any dissent against his wishes to do whatever he decides he's going to do in retaliation to this loss. Or at least that's how I read it. The corrupt will always set up these defenses to protect their corruption. And so when we go forward and we're talking about nation building, we're talking about making a strong Africa, one of the things we definitely gotta, sidestep and just get rid of, eradicate, is this notion that you're gonna do whatever you wanna do in your borders when we're supposed to be working together. That's an important concept to understand. Now, you will be challenged. There will be checks and balances. We're not allowing anyone to go run off and go do some bullshit that jeopardizes everyone else. Okay. The OAU, the very epicenter of Pan Africanism at birth, was severely weakened in its vision to institutionalize commitment to collective social responsibility, proclaimed as the basic framework of diplomacy and the totality of intra-African relations through legal technicalities. What this amounted to was that during internal social eruptions, even when they threatened the entire region, the OAU at the level of regional institution on one hand and fellow members on the other hand could not act as decisively. Could not act decisively. And that's a problem. If you have what's supposed to be a unifying body, how is it a unifying body cannot act in sorting out any differences, any problems, etc., within the bodies that is there to unify? It's just weird. It's just weird. And it's weird that we would do that to ourselves, considering where we came from. You know, like we really took in the oppressor's ways so much that we became the oppressor. This in itself clearly compromised the collective social responsibility upon which African communalism rested. But whatever the wisdom in its conception, the agonizing history of instability and repression that accompanied independence between 1957 and 1998 in Africa offered the first moment to test its fecundity. So, clear, flagrant abuses of the citizens' rights, and in some cases, outright decimation of African populations in bloody carnages, were categorized as internal affairs, from which OAU's mandate had been ousted. Illustrations abound all over the continent, but the chilling genocide of the Great Lakes states in the 90s remains the goriest case, where some member states even shut their borders against potential refugees in utter bewilderment. Indeed, so much to Pan-Africanist collective social responsibility. And that, I would expect that to read those kind of words in Europe. And I was alive when this happened, by the way. I'm fully aware of what was going down back in my hometown. And, that shows why you got to change up this education too. Those leaders at the time, see, this is what people don't talk about. Those leaders, who became the leaders at the time of the end of colonialism, they grew up under colonialist education. A lot of them went off to school in the colonizers' homeland. And thus, a lot of them thought that was the way. And so they brought that bullshit into rule with very few changes. And you got to understand, too, when you take rule of a country, its elite are the ones who are pushing and pulling a lot of the strings behind the scene. And if those elite made their bones under the colonizers, you could expect those elite to be colonizer-minded. And you could expect them to be needling the new, post-colonial, the new leadership. They're going to be needling them to carry out, the same shit that the colonizers were doing, essentially. This is why education has to change for us. Remember the episode I did? Go back in a couple weeks back. I did an episode where I talked about how, African leadership, how the education is supposed to create the leaders, it's supposed to create patriotism and create the leaders. And that's what we need. We need education that creates a patriotism in Black folks in general, makes you proud of who you are, proud of your people, etc. And so that the work you do is the work to uplift your people. Forget the personal stuff, like, people trying to protect the shit that they have. Forget all of that. It's about the community. Let me take a quick station ID break. I'll be right back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. By the way, tomorrow, it's going to be a big day. The Pro-Black Perspective with Only Say, the Bitter Medicine Podcast with yours truly, the Harsh Reality Podcast, and also the Queen's Council Podcast will all be doing an episode together tomorrow. So look out for when that posts. That should post soon enough. Look out for that post and check it out. Make sure to follow the Harsh Reality Podcast. Make sure to follow the Pro-Black Perspective. And sometimes I forget to mention it, but make sure to support Sharice with the Queen's Council, man. Like, encourage her to be on it. She does a good show, in-camera show. Last time she did an interview with another sister. It was a real good listen. Y'all check it out, man. So back to the reading here. Hold on, let me take a sip of water. The OAU failure to institutionalize Ubuntu reflected even more on the economic plane in a manner that threatened the survival of the continent during the launch of the current neoliberal era, globalization, in the 80s. Unfortunately, this global transformation made the West African economies prostrate. A combination of poor policy content, and outright imperialist subversion inflamed the African economies during the 80s with devastating impact in what is now branded in Africa historical chronology as a lost decade, a period which synchronized with the launch of the neoliberal era. Adedeji had contended that regional nations in economic crisis scamper for safety individually. True to this observation, African states during that yet agonizing moment in the history of the continent filed out one after the other to the gates of Bretton Woods, caps in hands, practically begging for handouts from IMF and World Bank. This initiated a sordid era in African international economic relations, where they were brought prostrate before the two global financial institutions, the IMF and World Bank, in various reform programs. I'll tell you, I remember I was a kid, and I've talked about this on the show before, but I had an uncle who was leader of a political party in my country, a socialist party. And I remember him explaining to me and my cousin, his son, how, like, look at what the IMF is doing, right? We were young guys. And from a young age, we had this understanding, like, damn, like, Africa is done because of these debts to the IMF and the World Bank. Like, the IMF and the World Bank, I'm sure you guys have heard before, these guys will loan you money to build, let's say you want certain monies to build, infrastructure in your home country. Let's say you want to, I'll use, was it Dominica? I think it was Dominica. I'll use Dominica as an example. Like, Dominica had a thriving banana industry back in around these times that they're talking about in this paper. And, you'll go to the IMF and take a loan because you wanna pump up the industry. And all they'll do, they'll lend you the money at these exorbitant rates. And then they'll have the US or whoever go and destroy your industry, right? Because that's what happened to Dominica. Dominica could have provided all the bananas, right? But it was allowed for Chiquita to come in. And basically that killed Dominica's banana industry. And this is what happens in Africa during this period, during the 80s and early 90s, you know? And I remember that clearly growing up, man. It's a shame to have to read it again. I remember feeling hurt about that when I was a kid. From the Mediterranean to the Cape, only few African countries were not involved in one or other form of adjustment stabilization program under the supervision of the new masters, IMF and World Bank. They came with severely harsh conditions, which usually comprise most of or all the policy recommendations in the Washington Consensus, in a manner that directly confronted their sovereignties. Thus, in many of these countries, IMF, World Bank staff supervise the central bank ministries of finance and trade, as well as the budget department. Indeed, the budgets of many had to be endorsed by IMF, World Banks, and its affiliated consultative groups or clubs in London, Paris, Washington, to mention just a few. And they're like the hurt for me. Like, you're in your own country, and these foreign entities are telling you what you can do from a budget standpoint. Imagine me holding your wallet and telling you what you can do, or your purse, telling you what you can do with your income, right? Astonishingly, the sanctity of independence and sovereignty, so much jealousy guarded in the doctrine of domestic jurisdiction in the documents and conduct of the OAU, was conceded cheaply to a new hegemony of the IMF and World Bank on a platter of gold, under excruciatingly humiliating circumstances. You know, one of these days, I think I might look up and read some of those terms that some of those African countries were under with the IMF and the World Bank. Impliedly, Africans could not protect their independence as a Pan Africanist envisaged. And that's another thing, too. You notice that the writer mentions Washington, right? The capital here in the U.S. And the thing about that is, when you sit up here and you talk about your ADOS and y'all built this shit and FBA and all that kind of stuff, that means you're complicit. That means you're complicit, right? If you're going to claim it, you got to claim the whole thing. You know, if you're going to claim it, you got to claim the whole thing. And so you're complicit. And only to say how to show, I think it was one of his Prove Me Wrong segments, where he was debating on two occasions these ADOS sisters. And on one of the occasions, he brought up the fact, like, yo, like, when there's some skirmish in the Congo and the U.S. is involved, there's always some Black American who's found dead, you know, as a soldier in the Congo. And then you want those same people to, like, lock arms with you and do so. When you take on, you know, this mindset that you are American and not African, understand then that you are complicit in the destruction of the same Pan-Africanism that you claim has only worked one way, coming from you guys. And this is where and this is where you can't have the dummies teaching the class. Because it's the dummies that are telling you that Pan-African has been a one-way street. It's the dummies who are not telling you, like, yo, America and France and, you know, with these banks and stuff like that, these are the guys who really killed Pan-Africanism, as well as some of the elites in Africa and the leadership that followed along. So it's not just from one side or the other, but understand that the role that you've been playing, right? And understand that you got to change up your mindset. We got to change things. Only time I say in the chat room is saying that, the Queen's Council was a fun. Shout out to Sister Reese, man. The Queen's Council episode where she interviewed that sister. I forget what the sister was named. Something like the black white or the white black sister, something like that. But whatever she was named, that was a good interview. And so I hope that the Queen's Council puts out more episodes. Also, Bonita says, quotes what I just said, you can't have the dummies. Yeah, you can't have dummies teaching the class. And this is what's going on out here definitely in the US now. You got dummies teaching the class. They don't know the whole story, so they're only teaching you a part of the story. Anyway. The uncoordinated character of the struggle ended up in recolonization, with the subversive implications for the ideals of communalism on the continent. To Africa and Africans, the neoliberal regime was an era of reorientation due to loss of internal autonomy. At the time, the OAU metamorphed into the African Union in 2002. A complex international superstructure with social relations becoming increasingly less tied to territorial frameworks. Had replaced the anti-imperialist intellectual climate and policy environment in which Pan Africanism was originally conceived and nurtured. As a consequence, the remnants of the genuine progressive forces on the continent, the very foundation of Pan-Africanism, were integrated into the management of the neo-colonial order. What a shame. Part 7, Pan-Africanism in the context of the neoliberal regime. Neoliberalism characteristically attacked the welfare state, which drives communalism. For instance, it included in its basic elements privatization of public enterprise and utilities and deregulation of social services. That's a thing that a lot of people don't think about, right? When you move away from the community, what ends up happening is you have the vultures that come in and start to partition, right, major aspects of everyday life. Its obsession with materialism and selfish quality of life and the disparities of rich and poor entrenched a culture of extreme individualism. Exactly. This brought it into direct conflict with American forms of social existence embedded in communalism. I remember a couple weeks back, speaking of Onita say in the chat room, a couple weeks back, Oni was mentioned something on Twitter, which was really, I guess it was really timely in a sense, even though others might not see it that way. But like the concept of a two-parent home, for example, is really a bad concept. Now, it's better than a one-parent home, of course. But really, as Africans, we supposed to be talking about, the village, right? Not just one or two people, but the entire village. Again, bringing us back to building curriculum. That's why it takes a village. We need everyone who has lived experiences and understandings in certain topics, providing some input into the curriculum. This is why we should never be doing stuff as one person, right? We should be doing stuff as communities. When you do stuff as one person, that's when the selfishness starts to kick in. People follow their belly. Where was I? Its obsession with materialism and selfish quality of life and the disparities of rich and poor entrenched a culture of extreme individualism. This brought into direct conflict with African forms of social existence embedded in communalism, but which regrettably the Pan Africanists could not institutionalize. Then the fundamental question is, what was the problem? And that brings us to the section called the dead community. Part of the problem was that the we, in our exposition of the concept of communalism in traditional Africa, was not replicated in the colonial and post-colonial state. The pre-colonial African states were in varying degree of sizes, small and large, with territorial boundaries and a ruling class. But contrary to common opinion, they were complex in structure as they were mostly founded and sustained through perpetual broadening of trans-local relations. While they survived on symbolic kinship bonds in the early phase of their evolution, translocal interdependence later replaced kinship as a medium of social identification. Right? Communalism as an instrument of social engineering, through its complex process, molded Africans into a respective mass within identifiable national units where each acted as a collective. These, I think they mean thus these was the framework in which patriotism, nationalism, and general commitment to common good in the society seems to have exhibited in African history. Okay. In contradistinction, modern African states are the products of European colonial architecture, put together with the sole purpose of serving its interests of exploitation. And that's an important thing to understand. Even in cases such as Nigeria, where different components were amalgamated, there was no integration of the country represented merely there was no integration of the country. There was no integration, and the country represented merely a geographical expression. The situation was further complicated by the contradictions that characterized colonial rule in Africa, where peoples were merged together in new groupings and for new purposes on one hand. Yeah, that's the BS of what these colonizers did, man. They created these lands and these borders, just for their own purposes. And so different groups were like thrown into these borders. And a lot of people attribute that as like a big part of the problem in Africa. On the other hand, the imperial order consciously aggravated their already existing divergences and initiated new ones. Ultimately, colonial rule could not build cohesive communities analogous to pre-colonial times that were coterminous with political entities. And I think Onita Ase and them did have a discussion about that too. Should there be borders in Kemet, in Africa, right? The socially fragmented colonial states with the colonial heritage Africans had as nations at independence. OAU's attempt to legitimize those entities by proclaiming them as sacrosanct and inviolate only partially succeeded. So national territorial boundaries existed without communities in colonial and post-colonial Africa. Yeah, a problem. Part of the obligation of the pre-colonial society was to ensure that everybody was accommodated within the limits of the political economy through commitment to collective social responsibility. The gap between the haves and the have-nots was narrowed to the limits of safety. God damn, my reading is piss poor tonight. Both Nkrumah and Nyerere agreed at different times that socialism, the modern expression of communalism, is an attitude of mind needed to ensure that the people care for each other's welfare. Therefore, if the underlying principles of communalism are not given correlated expression, class cleavages will arise, that's true, which are connected with economic disparities and thereby with political inequalities. In the chat room or in the comment section, I'd like you guys to tell me, do you see socialism as a modern version of African communalism? Speaking of the chat, I see a couple comments. KW Don 7. Hey, what's up, brother? Good to see you again. Haven't seen you in a little while now. FBA ADOS has the objective of segregating themselves from Africans on the continent and throughout the diaspora to convince Urugu to give them reparations to close the so-called wealth gap that created that created as the highest form of slave consciousness. Yeah, it's a lot of us, on myself included, we've talked a lot about this on social media. The problem with those two movements, for some reason, again, the dummies are teaching the class, and the class thinks, because the dummy said so, that if you separate yourself from other Africans, that somehow Eurasians will give you, these Europeans will give you some back pay for the free labor that your ancestors were forced to do, and that's just, if you believe that, then you're not paying attention to what's been going on. Onita Say says in the chat, nah, socialism isn't. All right, so he's answering my question, is socialism the new or the modern day version of communalism? The pro-black perspective, Onita Say goes on to say, Lenin explicitly said socialism comes out of European philosophy. Yeah, that's my understanding. My understanding is most of these economic systems that you hear about, that we talk about, it's a European thing, and some of them are intended to be a European fix for a European problem, right? So so it doesn't really help us, and that's something I wish I could go back and talk to my uncle about, because he was an adherent of socialism, like I mentioned earlier. True to their words, the glorification of socialism, communalism, perhaps due to its inherent incoherent or improper digestion, lacked correlating practical expression. For instance, post-colonial communalism, either at the level of the country or continent, needed to sustain collective social responsibility through the provision of infrastructure. People needed roads, access to health facilities, potable clean water, and access to education, to mention a few of them. Socialism provided no means to secure these either, through development in industry or in agriculture, and no way to find food for the population. By 1970s, African countries had accumulated much debt, so that servicing it had become its priority. Consequently, provision of infrastructure was compromised. Even the few ones that survived colonial rule started to decay, arising from lack of maintenance. As George put it in the case of Ghana, but which mirrored the situation in other parts of Africa, quote, infrastructure began to crumble for lack of maintenance. Roads started to deteriorate and telephones refused to work. Even hospitals in many African countries had no running water. At the Akomfo Anokie hospital in Ghana, patients were asked to bring their own bandages, blankets, and food. Educational facilities soon began to disintegrate. Makerere University in Uganda, once called the Harvard of Africa, is now in total ruins. The University of Ghana at Legon, once a world-class institution, has not seen a single coat of fresh paint since the colonists left in the 50s. You see, a part of the thing about these economic systems that these Africans tend to keep bringing up, right? Like socialism and stuff like that, communism and whatnot. A part of the problem is that the reason why the Europeans could like discuss these philosophies is because Europeans ultimately form these alliances, right? They ultimately form these alliances. Like I remember in college talking to a brethren, and his take on communism was that, well, communism never really worked because the alliances weren't permitted to happen. So a lot of people who came up in Cuba, which is close to my own country, is, a lot of them came up in a time of suffering. Food lines and bread lines and all this kind of stuff, food imported from Russia, the farmlands being taken over by the Russians and all this kind of stuff, and Israel and all this kind of stuff like that. So, the alliances become the problem, right? For us, we are not, as Africans, we're not going to have the alliances, nor should we want them with the Europeans who practice these philosophies. But they somehow, to some degree, have these alliances, and so that's why these ideas, at least in their minds, could work. All over Africa, class cleavages emerged in each state and receded into one form of authoritarianism or the other in a manner that ridiculed socialism or communalism and portrayed it as merely appropriated instrument for class protection. Personification of the state through one-party system soon became the predominant character of the Pan Africanist politics, which is very true. Very, very true. And engendered gross inequalities. Illustratively, Nkrumah was Ghana, Keita, Mali, Touré, Guinea, Tubman, Liberia, Ivory Coast, Boigny, Zaire, Mobutu. The failure to build cohesive institutions created a void. The various peoples historically adapted to communal existence in the pre-colonial welfare state were left nostalgic. Under colonial rule, state apparatus was employed to pacify them. But under independence, when freedom was to be guaranteed, this nostalgia propelled certain reactions that tended to aggravate the inherent disharmony in the new fragile entities. In some cases, it precipitated bitter cross-border irredentist struggles, as was in Ogaden crisis between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The UA irredentists claimed cross Ghana, Togo boundaries, Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic under Polisario versus Morocco. The Eritrea-Ethiopian one, that one I'm pretty familiar with. In the latter case, Morocco withdrew from the OAU when it recognized the independence of Sahrawi Republic in 1984. To recap, actual nations never existed in Africa after the colonial invasion. Colonialism did not leave them as a legacy. African statesmen could not build them upon the inadequate social entities they inherited from the colonial regime either. That's nothing but a word right there. That's it right there. To recap, actual nations never existed in Africa after the colonial invasion. Colonialism did not leave them as a legacy. African statement could not build them upon the inadequate social entities they inherited. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you cannot follow behind these Europeans. Before I get into the conclusion, you guys in the comment section who are live with me right now, what are your thoughts on this paper up to this point, just before we hit the conclusion? What are your thoughts on this paper, if any? And again, thank you guys for hopping on and listening to me read this paper with commentary. I do appreciate it. And I hope that there is something to be taken from it. I see a few things that definitely can be taken from it that, like I mentioned, that could be applied to our conversation that we had today during the brainstorm that Onita Say spearheaded for the work that we need to be doing in the year 2021. Make sure I reposted it on Twitter. I will repost it on Facebook after I finish this broadcast. Make sure you guys go and check it out. And make sure you guys check it out and, leave your comments, etc. Onita Say in the comments says exactly on the nation, but yeah, I mean, Africans never had a nation. Once the Europeans came along, that was it when it came to nationhood, right? And after they left, there was nothing to really build a nation on, just confusion. Post the highlights on social media. Okay. So, that's something I've been wanting to do, but for me, that's like the difficult thing is to do all the things. My intention really was to write a blog post for like all of these different readings that I've been doing, that points out the highlights of the readings. But this is where, if you're out there and you're interested in helping, this is where, I could receive the help instead of me having to push all the buttons and check this and check that while I'm trying to do the show. Some help during, some help in preparation will be cool. This way I could actually write these blog posts and kind of synthesize the main points in a write-up, So in conclusion, the consciousness in the campaign for African cultural renaissance to resolve African problems enunciated in Pan Africanism and its variant of socialism deserves applause. But in embarking on this mission, Nkrumah and his colleagues probably inadequately situated African communalism in its proper context or underestimated the hemorrhage imperialism inflicted on Africa. And I believe that's true. I believe a guy like Nkrumah meant well, and I know we say that a little too much in Black society, right? This person probably means well, but at the end of the day, we got to look at the actions. That's the problem, right? But a lot of our African elders, I think, really underestimated the situation that they were embarking on upon, achieving so-called independence from the colonial powers. And that's a big blunder. And it's almost a blunder I don't understand in a certain sense as well. Haiti made a similar blunder as well. And to come back, many decades later and continue to make those blunders is just mind-blowing to me. In the end, Pan-Africanism produced the direct opposite of its objective, individualism, epitomized by neoliberalism. That hurts to hear that. Did that sting anyone else like it stung me, man? Damn. To transcend beyond the current mediocre levels of Pan Africanism, Africa as a continent needs viable states. Regional cooperation reflects the character of its component members who are expected to reinvent their good governance at home at a broader continental dimension. From this perspective, the prevalent distortion of constitutional amendment, now a reigning phenomenon in Central Africa and furthering agenda of self-perpetuation, only reminds us how far apart we are from our cherished heritage of communalism. Therefore, more conscious efforts are required to revive it, particularly through its incorporation into academic curriculum in all African universities. And then here are the references. But that last line is a word too. Therefore, more conscious efforts are required to revive it, particularly through its incorporation into academic curriculum in all African universities. And that's what I've been saying, right? And I know I probably sound like a broken record, and I apologize. But, you know, that's it right there. Like, we got to go back and bring back our true nature. Before colonialism, before contact with the Eurasian, we got to go back to it. And the sense of communalism, as I talked about in the last episode and now this one, that communalism, that humanness, and etc. That's what we need to get back to. Once we start to foster that in our youth, and foster the concept, the idea of Africa, of a nation called, Kemet or Africa, however you want to term it. Once we start doing that, then we'll have better leadership. And once we incorporate like nation building events and brainstorming and stuff from the children up, right? From kids, once you start to put that in them, right? You'll see that we will build better nations coming out of, without, whatever situation we're in with these Europeans or what have you, or these European banks, etc. Like, it's the education that's going to really lift us out of this stuff, not the entertainment. The entertainment is cool, you could laugh and this, that, and the other. And I wish some of these guys would just be entertainment. But the problem is they get into serious discourse, areas of activity, and because of where we are as a people, especially, and most people generally, but we're concerned with our people, we just like the entertainment, man. And that's something I was going to bring up, as I have Ointa say here listening in, as well as others. I have about 5 people in here. The thing I wanted to mention earlier in the brainstorm, but a lot was going on, is that, we have a problem in pro-Black or conscious society. We have a problem of, we often are preaching to the choir. So a lot of the reason why you tune into the Pro-Black Perspective or the Harsh Reality Podcast or Queen's Council, what have you, is and find that there's only a few people tuned in. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the people who would listen to our shows are the people who are already in the vicinity, so to speak, of conscious thinking. Right? If not immersed, they're in the vicinity. And the thing that we got to find a way to do is to get through, in my humble opinion, right? I'm what I'm saying here is separate from the brainstorm of today, but it did cross my mind during the brainstorm. Like, it makes no sense if we're doing work just for the people who are already, if not on the same sentence, definitely reading in the same paragraph, or at least on the same page with us already, We got to find ways to convert, right? To awaken our folks. And that's really what it's about. And I think, as I said before, that's what I believe the benefits up front is the way to go. That's just my belief. Okay. Anyway, guys, this has been, as only just say, Pro Black Perspective just said, facts, get through to the masses. Yeah, we got to get through to those who are in slumber right now. Right? Those who are awake, some of them need to be handled too, to be honest, because this election period, reveal some things. But a lot of y'all in the conscious community are more Tariq and them than ones would think, right? But but definitely check out the works that Onita Say is doing with the Pro Black Perspective, and he has a Discord server. You guys jump on that, ask him how to get on and help him with the work that he's doing. He's doing a lot of stuff on that server. I have a server as well, but I'm not doing as much as he is. Maybe in the future I'll open it up to folks. Make sure to listen to all the shows on KWAZ Radio. And stay tuned, keep your ears and your eyes open for when we do the mega show with all the entities on the podcast network. Thanks again for those of you who joined me in the chat room and actually had a little conversation with me back and forth there. I appreciate that. In the future, we'll do more of the same. Until next time, guys, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.